Today's episode is about the final step in my story production process, and that is editing. So if you've been following along with the process so far, you should now have a second draft. So just as a quick recap on the process, the first step in the storytelling process was obviously having a story idea that you want to tell, but then mapping the story on a timeline was the first step, and the timeline acting as the blueprint for the story that you're eventually going to publish to the world. We then looked at finishing the story on a clear one idea that would be a bridge into your content. We then looked at creating a spoken first draft in order to tell the story quickly, efficiently, and get a automated transcript out of telling that story. Last week's episode then we were looking at AI second drafts of using different tools to knock your transcript into shape so that you should now have a second draft that's 85% of the way there. So today's episode is about editing. We're looking at that last 15% or 20% or whatever it is. Editing was something that I covered on the podcast 5 years ago when I first covered these topics. So I'm going to replay that content to you, and then I'll be back in a little bit with some further comments from 2026. It's a dark autumn evening in 1999. I'm sitting under a daylight lamp at my parents' computer, editing my Year 9 IT coursework. I'm converting my longhand notes into an electronic document. I'm editing it as I go, and I'm saving the thing every 2 minutes in case Windows 98 crashes on me again. Eventually I decide that enough is enough, and I turn the light out and I go to sleep. The next day in school, we're in IT class, and the IT teacher, Mr. Bell, says, "Has anyone else got anything to hand in?" A few people chuckled. IT wasn't always a subject that was taken very seriously, and no one moved. And I just sat there, rooted to my chair, my IT coursework sitting in my bag. And I remember this story because it's a very clear example of a time that I've done the work and not handed it in. Now, why exactly I didn't hand it in is maybe a life lesson. Just because nobody else is handing in work doesn't mean that I don't. But I think also I had undervalued the editing work that I'd done on my IT coursework. And I see this effect to a degree when people write emails, or particularly when people start editing emails. I've worked on email sequences with clients where we go around in circles over and over, writing and then editing and then more editing, to the point where we've edited so much that the client never actually sends the emails. And an email that's never sent can't possibly do you any good. I think most of us generally are better editors than we are writers. Perhaps that isn't always true, but I think most of us like to edit perhaps more than we like to write. I think editing, once you get the hang of it, is an easier task, because editing is to do with reduction. It's taking your work and it's sharpening it. Most of us can take a lump of raw material and sharpen it into something good. It's far more difficult to create that lump of raw material out of seemingly nothing. So today's podcast is all about editing. As always, we're going to cover 3 ideas. The first idea is reduction. The second idea is verbs and descriptions. And the third idea is space. So let's have a look at the first idea. When I'm asked to give feedback on my students' work, so throughout my Nurture Email Mastery course, people have to submit assignments throughout the course. And those build up toward the end of the course where you're submitting an email to me for review. And I will edit it. I'll do a preliminary editing job. And I would say that the place where I spend most of my focus and the place where I make the most edits is the opening paragraph of the email. Drayton Bird talks about this. He says that when many writers start to write, we kind of clear our throat for a couple of paragraphs. So often the first couple of paragraphs is kind of you meandering into the story. And actually you want to make sure that the first paragraph does pull people into the story. If you think about it, when an email comes in, the recipient first looks at the sender name, which is why the sender name is the most important part of the email. They then look at the subject line, and then after that, they'll glance at the opening line or the opening paragraph of the email. So the job of the opening paragraph is to really pull the reader into the email. Often in the opening paragraph, a bit like my IT story, you might have to set the scene of the story. So I told you that it was a dark autumn evening in 1999. As I'm thinking about this now, there's small tweaks to that, there's small edits to that I might make that will help to pull you into the story. And this is really getting at the second idea, which is verbs and descriptions. But I could, for instance, say that it was a windy, dark night in autumn 1999. The fact that it's windy evokes the idea that there is a storm coming. It sets a degree of, this is done very carefully in films or movies, where the weather kind of reflects the mood of what is going on. But often what I'm doing when I edit my emails, or when I edit my students' emails, is sometimes we'll delete the first paragraph altogether. Sometimes you might want to make a conscious decision to start in the heat of the action and then explain the context later on. That's also fine. I could have chosen to open the story by saying I was sitting there under a daylight lamp at my parents' computer, frantically editing my IT coursework, which was due the next day. I could have opened with that, but I didn't. I chose to open with the context instead. So you've got a conscious decision there, and perhaps it maybe would have been more effective to open directly with the story and then come back and explain the context later on. Another thing you'll want to look out for when you're editing in terms of reduction is you'll want to look out for rhetorical questions that you're posing the reader. In telling our stories, we want to let the reader come to their own conclusions and form their own questions in their own mind. So sometimes you'll find questions in the text like, will my coursework be good enough? And obviously you just don't need that, because the worry is implied by the fact that I'm frantically working on my coursework late at night the day before it's due in. So editing is a process of reduction. Throughout an entire email, you're often looking at removing sentences, maybe removing paragraphs, often maybe even splitting a paragraph into two, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's a process of reduction. We're not normally trying to add in more, we're normally trying to take stuff out. So that was the first point, and that was reduction. The second idea is focusing on verbs and descriptions. So in your story, you really need to pull the reader into the story and let them imagine being a fly on the wall in the situation. Or even better, letting them imagine being in your shoes in that situation. So how would we do that? Well, I could have told you at the start of the story about my inner concerns about my IT coursework not being good enough. So what else might we edit in the story? Well, I've said that I'm sitting there under a daylight lamp at my parents' computer. Perhaps sitting isn't a very good description. Perhaps it would be better if I said I was hunched under a daylight lamp at my parents' computer. So the first version of the story that I opened the podcast with was that it's an autumn evening in 1999. We've now edited this being it's a windy, dark autumn evening in 1999. I'm hunched under a daylight lamp at my parents' computer. So do you see how those changes, it's only small changes, it's quite subtle, but by switching out those words, so by adding the descriptions of it being a windy, dark evening, and by saying that I was hunched rather than sitting, and this isn't to say that hunched is, the only option here, but I quite like it because it evokes an image of struggle. It evokes an image of struggling under the weight of this thing. I've said that I'm saving my work every 2 minutes in case Windows 98 freezes. So I think there's maybe not a huge amount we can edit here. Perhaps we could say that I'm neurotically saving it every 2 minutes in case Windows 98 freezes. Every 2 minutes is probably generous, actually. I was probably saving it about every 20 seconds. So perhaps we could switch 2 minutes for 20 seconds. Which sounds like I'm being over the top, but for everyone who remembers using or creating a Word document on Windows 98, then yeah, You were playing with fire, really. In school the next day, when Mr. Bells asked, has anyone else got anything to hand in? I feel like, looking back on that situation, I maybe could have, in the story, explained the frivolity of the situation for most of my fellow students. IT was deemed, not a subject worthy of panic, and Mr. Bell was not a scary teacher. And perhaps I could have described Mr. Bell in more detail to enable you to understand that. Because initially in the story, all I've really told you is what I said. I've then said, a few people laughed. I sat there, rooted. And I think rooted is the right word. It was like my brain wanted to move, like my brain wanted to go and hand in my coursework, but I just wasn't able to. I think if I was editing this, I would change it to be something like, a few people laughed as chairs scraped on the floor as everyone else prepared to leave. I sat there, rooted. Because that also helps to describe the situation, and it helps to describe why I didn't hand in my work. Because everyone else just laughed it off and got up to leave. So do you see what we're doing here? We're trying to describe the intricacies of the situation. And we're trying to improve the way that we describe things to help bring the reader into the story. Often you can kind of improve an email just by going through and paying attention to the verbs. The verbs are like where the rubber hits the road in terms of things that happen throughout the story. I actually keep a copy of Perry Marshall's Swiss Army knife tool by my desk, which has a list of auditory, kinesthetic, and visual verbs. So he lists, he's got 3 pages of compelling verbs described by kinesthetic, auditory, and visual. And often, you might switch an auditory verb. So in me saying that a few people laughed as chairs scraped across the floor as people got up to leave, the scraping across the floor is an auditory sound. So it adds in an extra dimension to the story because we're adding in an extra sense, which makes it easier for the reader to imagine being in a situation. So you might want to consider that verbs and descriptions can be auditory, they can be visual, or they can be kinesthetic in terms of how you felt. The third idea I want to talk about is space, which is really the idea that you shouldn't edit too much as you go. And I use the word too much deliberately, kind of to cover my own ways, really, because I do edit as I go to a degree, but I try not to edit too much. It's really better if you try, especially as you're learning to write compelling story-based content. It's really helpful if you can try to separate the writing part of the process and the editing part of the process. Because I think they use different parts of your brain. And actually, if you're switching from writing to editing, you don't really get into a flow with the writing, and you don't really do a great job at the editing. I think the optimum space to leave between writing and editing is 24 hours. So I will often write an email, and in the heat of the moment, I will decide that, Shakespeare himself couldn't have written better prose. And there's a great temptation, a great urge to send the email there and then. But give it 24 hours, and I'll look back at it a day later. I wouldn't say that I read it and wonder what I was thinking necessarily, but there's often edits I would change. There's often things that I would improve. So I think you need a bit of space. Because when you've just been in the flow with your writing, it's very difficult to look at what you've written with any degree of perspective. In terms of you planning your workflow, if you're going to send an email on Friday, you want to have the draft finished at latest on Wednesday. That will allow you 24 hours so you can then edit the email on Thursday. I think as well, you don't want to go through too many rounds of editing. I think for those of us who like editing, and I alluded to this with some of my old clients, there's a great temptation just to edit forever and not actually send the thing. Which sounds like a made up risk, but it's a very real risk. I've seen this happen where emails don't get sent because the email is still in editing. The 80-20 principle applies here. You'll get 80% of the editing benefit from 20% of the editing work. So you probably want to limit your editing time quite significantly, especially if you have perfectionist tendencies. That's really what we're getting at here. If you don't have perfectionist tendencies, then that's fine. this probably isn't going to be a major issue for you. But I think often I work with writers who do want it to be perfect, at least in how they've envisioned the email in their mind. And you really need to let that go. So as long as you waited 24 hours, and as long as you made a quick round of edits, that's normally enough. You might also want to get someone else to proofread the email. I would say that I'm okay at spotting typos, but I'm terrible at spotting typos in my own work. There's something to do with proofreading your own work that makes typos especially hard to spot. And the worst part is that you won't spot the typos until the email gets sent, and then when the email comes through to your inbox, you will spot the typo straight away, because that's how it works. So there's probably an editing step where you edit the email using the steps we've discussed, so with a view to reduction, with a view to sharpening your verbs and descriptions. But then there's maybe a role for, someone in the implementer role. We were talking about the implementer role earlier in an earlier podcast episode. Somebody else who is good at proofreading, who isn't... It doesn't even need to be someone who understands the subject that you're writing about. It just needs to be someone who's good at spotting typos. So that's something you might want to consider as well. I think, like most things, email marketing ultimately at scale is a team game. So you need multiple people to be involved in it. You may need multiple writers, and it might be the case that you have an editor on the team who is separate from the writers as well. That's also a possibility. It depends on the scale. If you're sending 20 emails a month, then that kind of makes sense. If you're sending one email a month, then it doesn't make sense. But just consider that you are maybe not the best placed person to spot typos in your work. There is much more on editing that we haven't had a chance to cover. The first place to go is to head to my book, Simple Story Selling, where I talk about more editing tips. So in the book, I talk about adding dialogue. I talk about paragraph and sentence length. I talk about splitting stories across multiple emails. So I can't go through all of those things here, but you can pick up Simple Story Selling from Amazon in Kindle or paperback formats. But otherwise, we're at the end of this episode, so let's do a bit of a recap. Well, today's episode has been about editing. I shared a story from my time at school where I failed to hand in my IT coursework. And then we've looked at sharpening this story in a couple of ways. We've talked about reduction. We've talked about potentially starting in the heat of the action rather than starting with the context of the story. We've then talked about sharpening our verbs and descriptions throughout the story, with a view to really bringing the reader into the story and letting them be a fly on the wall in the situation. The third idea we talked about with space was the idea that you shouldn't really edit as you go. It's better to try and do the writing, stay in the flow of your writing, and then have a gap of about 24 hours and then come back and do the editing a day later, because you'll spot a lot more that you'll be able to improve after a 24-hour break. Okay, we're back in 2026 now. I was very worried going into this episode. I really thought that editing would have been a topic that I'd have to re-record with all of the tools changes, the developments in AI and so on. And actually, I don't think it is. What I think has changed is I think editing has gone upstream. So instead of editing, when you say editing, you think of small tweaks, small changes. You think of correcting typos in particular. All of that has already been covered in the AI second draft. So AI is doing a lot of that lower value editing earlier on in the process, and that means here that we can spend more time and effort on the things I've been talking about in this episode, on having powerful verbs, on describing the situations that bring people into the story. And the good news is that AI is actually pretty shoddy at selecting the right verbs. It's good at pinpointing typos and poor grammar. Yes, in principle, you could try and prompt it to use great verbs, but there's an element of human judgment here. We're now at the point of making sure that you're using the right word to convey the meaning that you want to get across. So this, for me, is a human step. As Susan Sontag once said, words are like arrows in the rawhide of reality. So you want to make sure that you've got exactly the right words. And we're talking about power words here. So the advice that I gave in this episode basically holds. I am in the editing process. I am putting more focus on my time on the opening paragraph. So where I was saying that a lot of people, you can often cut out the first paragraph and not really lose the gist of the story because people will clear their throat. That basically still applies. And then going through and trying to pinpoint, can you use better verbs, for instance? So for me now, editing is more about impact than it is about grammar. We're trying to maximize the impact of the story and make sure that we're conveying the feeling that we want to get across. And again, this doesn't have to take a massive amount of time. And the better AI gets at the second draft, or it's almost like the less time we spend on this. Something I would change from what I said 5 years ago was I mentioned at the end that there's a possible role for an implementer to go over typos, spell check and things like that. I think that's basically redundant now. I think the implementer role has largely been replaced by your AI tool. And again, this all feeds back to the fact that editing has gone upstream. So I still think that editing is a very important part of the process. I actually think it's a fun part of the process. I actually think that a lot of us also are better editors than writers. Once you've got something there to work with, it's quite easy to reword it and to build on it. And again, as I said in the episode, you don't want to be building on it forever. You don't want it to sit in editing forever and never be sent. So having deadlines helps. So this podcast goes out every week. I can't edit it forever. I can do some initial edits, and at some point you have to cut off and say, no, enough's enough. Hopefully we're most of the way there. But yeah, in the time that you do spend editing, you want it to be on making sure that the feeling that you're trying to convey really comes across in the writing. Today's episode then has been about editing in terms of really making sure that the finished article delivers the impact and maintains your voice and keeps people reading, makes people want to. People should always read one line and can't wait to read the next. That's the pinnacle of any storytelling. Something I would say with this process is keep putting it into practice. All of us as humans are storytellers. We are natural born storytellers. And I would argue first and foremost verbal storytellers. So keep putting this into practice. Keep doing it. The more you practice it, the faster you'll get. The more you put your story out into the world across multiple modes, across written formats, audio formats, video formats. That's why I do these podcast episodes in video now. So if you want to watch my wrinkly face as I talk through these principles, you can do. It's about covering multiple modes. So keep going, keep practicing that storytelling muscle. The more you practice it, the better you're going to get. Until people assume that you're some kind of storytelling expert, which is probably what happened to me at some point. And really, it's just a function of practice and also feedback, getting feedback on your stories as well. What I'm going to do on next week's episode is I'm going to revisit story research. So we've covered the storytelling process of how do we take a story idea, how do we quickly, efficiently convert story ideas into publishable stories across multiple media. That's been the process over the last few weeks. Next week's episode is going to look at ongoing research of making sure that we never run out of story ideas to write about. Because writer's block is a thing for most people, and one of the ways that you get around writer's block is by becoming a story researcher and always being on the lookout for stories to tell. So we'll cover that next time out. Thanks for joining me. If you found this episode of Story Systems helpful, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. I'll send you a copy of my Lead Incubator System Blueprint and also my top 5 core story prompts for entrepreneurs. Head to storyrob.com/podcast. You can also find my book by searching on Amazon for for simple story selling. See you next time.